The transatlantic slave trade, taking place between the 16th and 19th century, has had devastating impacts on Africa as a continent. According to the studies of Nathan Nunn in 2008, roughly 20 million Africans were taken from their homes. The jobs given to these slaves were labor-intensive, typically harvesting sugarcane, tobacco, or cotton. This event played an important role in shaping Africa's society today. Historical accounts from the transatlantic slave trade suggest that common insecurity, less trust, and weakened demographics, which have been the reason for warfare and violence, had impacts on institutional, social, and economic development of African nations. This video will explore and discuss what transatlantic slave trade outcome has been the biggest factor in hindering Africa's economy as a continent. Weakened African demographics as a continent has been arguably the biggest factor of Africa's hindered economy. The continent of Africa as a whole has lost tens of millions of able-bodied population, and according to research of Manning in 1990, the population of Africa in 1800 was only half as expected if the slave trade hadn't taken place. The article Understanding the Long-Run Effects of Africa's Slave Trades by Nathan in 2017 suggests that when slave captors arrived on African land, the majority of captives were women in their childbearing years and young men. These groups of individuals were possibly ready to start families. European slavers left behind elderly, disabled, or otherwise dependent individuals. These groups left behind are physically and mentally less able to contribute towards the economic health of societies. This depopulation, resulting in captivity fear by other tribes, also led to agricultural development difficulties in Western Africa, which many communities, economies, and families were dependent on. An analysis conducted by Nathan Nunn in 2008 showed evidence of Africa's poor performance explained by history, which was characterized by over 400 years of slave raiding. The analysis provides evidence and historical accounts of slave trade resulting in weakening or underdevelopment of political structures and broader and more diverse ethnic groups. The study shows the countries or areas with the most slaves taken are also the most underdeveloped politically and economically by the end of the 19th century. These countries are the most ethnically fragmented to this day. Another source similarly suggests that African men taking their prime disrupted the culture and economy of a nation. The disrupt meant that the society was less able to progress. According to Eno's YouTube video, What Effects Did the Slave Trade Have in Africa? Slave trade also made it harder for the African continent as a whole to participate in the Algerian and Industrial Revolution, as possible people who could help with the participation in such revolutions were taken into slavery. These revolutions meant that Africa couldn't develop economically, and this was due to a weakened society. As well as unsuccessful participation in both agrarian and industrial revolutions, in the report of Eno's video, What Effects Did the Slave Trade Have in Africa? Africans weren't able to resist European colonization. European colonization of African kingdoms and empires heavily affected the economic development. In summary, a weakened demographic, a result of heavy slave raiding from neighboring kingdoms, and the possibly most contributive individuals taken to slavery, led to weaker and more fragmented societies. These groups then couldn't participate in both agrarian and industrial revolutions and were colonized by Europeans. The outcomes also led to agricultural development difficulties. Weakened demographics in Africa have definitely hindered its economic development. Numerous sources, on the other hand, suggest that insecurities and decrease of trust within nations has had big impacts, possibly more devastating effects on Africa's economic development than weakened demographics. Betrayal and distrust were the results of slave raiding and kidnapping of Africans by neighboring tribes, influencing warfare such as the Jaga invasion from 1568 to 1570. On a survey conducted by Nathan Nunn, slave trade resulted in long-term deterioration of legal or political institutions, which then were less able to enforce good behavior among citizens, a result of less trust among citizens today. Less trust has a strong relationship between poor economies and less trades. Another possibility from the survey conducted by Nathan Nunn indicates that slave trades made individuals and descendants inherently less trusting, which has created a culture of distrust. Greater distrust developed and persisted over generation due to betrayal, even after the end of the slave trade. A research conducted by Nunn and Wanchcon in 2011 hints that slave trade similarly resulted in the creation of trust. In our society, trust is long hypothesized as an important foundation of economic prosperity, as reported by Algan and Cahook's research in 2010. During the slave trade, it was frequent to be kidnapped, tricked, and sold into slavery. Historical events indicate that the commonality of these forms of betrayal, with 20% of Africans becoming slaves due to them being tricked by a family or friend, were significantly high. Common betrayal led to weaker trust among citizens, resulting in weaker economical institutions. As the slave trade progressed further, the high slave demand from the Europeans, the pervasiveness of the slave traders and merchants, and the competition of the throne within the Kingdom of Congo resulted in uncontrollable slave capturing raiding, which ties up with the common betrayal experience, just as none suggested, as the capturing increased. Even after Congo's king's request of removing Portuguese merchants, slave raiding continued into the 16th century. This culminated into the Jaga invasion from 1568 to 1570, and then a big civil war from 1665 to 1709, according to reports of Haywood in 2009. These wars caused big instability within the country, affecting the economic development of Congo. In Ted's YouTube video, The Atlantic Slave Trade, What Too Few Textbooks Told You, Anthony Hazard, the video mentions how kingdoms would buy European arms with slaves. This caused an arms race between kingdoms. African neighbors were led to big competition due to European demand for slaves, and capturing slaves was a motivation for war. According to Eno's YouTube video, What Effects Did the Slave Trade Have in Africa?, the increase of competition and betrayal between kingdoms, as well as the influx of European weapons, caused warfare and instability, which continues to this day, heavily hindering Africa's economic development. In summary, uncontrolled slave raiding and frequent tricking, kidnapping, and selling family members and friends resulted in less trust and security amongst and within African kingdoms. This distrust caused warfare between kingdoms and groups, ethnically fragmenting future nations to be formed and causing instability in the continent. According to research from Algan and Kahuk in 2010, as well as Nunn, it is clearly evident that the trust plays a big role in economic institutions. The decrease of trust has been a strong factor of why Africa's economy is less developed. Understanding the long-term impacts of the slave trade in Africa is still under progress. The evidence suggests that there are big factors which we know of that have impacted and helped shape Africa's economy, thus hindering it from what the economy could have been if the slave trade had not taken place. Weaker demographics and less trust amongst Africans are a few of the outcomes which hinder Africa's economy to this day. With the perspectives of historians and experts on this topic, it is clear that there isn't one major outcome, as there are numerous which have had their own share of impact and effects on Africa's economy. Many outcomes from the slave trade together have helped create other outcomes and problems like warfare and instability within the continent, which has had devastating effects on Africa's economical development. Thank you for watching our analysis on the topic on what transatlantic slave trade outcome has been the main factor in hindering Africa's economy as a continent. Stay tuned for the next documentary. Was the transatlantic slave trade the only major event which has had big impacts on Africa's economy? Has the Cold War impacted Africa's economy in any way? This will be the topic for the next documentary, though below is a brief introduction on the topic. Cold War interventions and alliances had devastating impacts on Africa's economy. This event led to Angola, Mozambique, and the DRC experiencing the most bloody proxy battles between the East and the West. Once again, thank you for watching our documentary on what transatlantic slave trade outcome has been the biggest factor in hindering Africa's economy as a continent. We hope that this video has helped develop your understanding on this topic.